Hi there, Randy Green here, and welcome to a little podcast on mythology and the interpretation of mythology. And this is interesting for those of us who are working with what we could say, trying to find the answers of our origin, as well as how great a degree can we put truth into mythology. And those of you who are familiar with me, you know I have a bachelor degree in theology from the University of Copenhagen. I'm a psychotherapist. I've got different kind of degrees within business and yada yada, all of these kind of fancy titles that kind of shows that I'm not just anyone who just look into this one and then cook up things on my own. But let me put it this way. My mind works in mysterious ways. I don't have a recall memory as many that work within the scientific community have. I have what we could call a process memory, and I process information differently. And as those of you who listen to my other videos at the Whole Academy channel, as well as my Whole Academy website. But here on YouTube, I have the Whole Academy channel where I take up different topics that I want to discuss. And this would, in a way, be more appropriate for the Whole Academy channel. But here we are talking about Enki and some of the old Sumerian gods. And that's why I want to put it here instead. Because those of us who are trying to find head and tail in these narratives, we go to the myths around the Anunnaki, and that means the ones that came from the heavens, Anu, heaven, Na, towards Ki, earth, and try to understand what that is all about. And we must, of course, be careful. So let me just say that this is not a scientific explanation that is, what do you call it? I want to put the word in commemorated, but I don't know if there's the right word to put it there. It's not what we say within accepted sciences. This is my personal interpretation, trying to navigate through a very difficult, muddy, exploration and research journey to find the information that would somehow collaborate with my personal memory. So that's a completely different viewpoint to have. And I must be completely honest that most of the time when I do read the translation of the Sumerian myths, which we also looked into when I was studying the Hebrew Bible, the Torah in its own language in Hebrew, and we could see in the Copenhagen interpretation, we work with the understanding that, and I'm here saying the Copenhagen interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, because that is a specific way to work with the information of the Hebrew Bible that is not similar to the way they work with the Hebrew Bible in the US or in Britain or somewhere else in the world. Scholars work differently from different paradigms and different interpretation systems. So that's the first most important thing to put in there. So in the Copenhagen interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, which were instigated by a very clever Danish professor, which I was lucky enough to have as my teacher. Not that I had him for a long time because of personal reasons. I had to take a break in my studies, and I took it up 8 years later. Let me just put it that way. I was alone with my kid, so it was a little bit too much to both do very complex studies and learning ancient languages and live up to the requirements and what I needed to do to put in the papers and the assignments, and at the same time be a single mom. So that was a little bit over the top of what I could do, and at the same time also earning money on the side. So therefore I took a break from the studies and focused on earning money and being a mom. And then I returned to the studies later on and completed it. So just to kind of say, okay, that's the personal angle on it. And unfortunately, when I returned, Peter Lemmeke, as it's called in Danish, were not, or Niels Peter Lemmeke, were no longer teaching at the University of Copenhagen in the Old Testament and in his original ideas, but then were only teaching in Akkadian, and I actually tried to take one of his courses, but learning the Akkadian language were a little bit over the top for me. It was just a little bit looking at these own weird signs and symbols that creates the Sumerian language, which just for me kind of made no sense. There was no intuitive understanding of it compared to the Hebrew images that composes their language, the ancient Hebrew. That's completely, when I look at these different symbols, they mean something to me. They ring a bell. They kind of somehow speak to me. Whereas the Sumerian language, when I look at that, I'm just kind of, is that a word? so that's, I'm still, when I see lectures of scholars that have interpreted that cuneiform language and have put it into some kind of understanding, I'm just kind of baffled of how do you even derive that kind of layer. I know they have done it, compare it to other text system of the same area and the same time period, and the way that scholars work with different languages to interpret what they are and the meaning of them, etc. So this is, it's not that I don't understand the dynamics of it. It's just, does it say something to you as a person when we try to understand things? There are certain things that are intuitive that we can look at and say, yeah, that speaks to us, that gives meaning. And then there are other stuff which is kind of the brain just shuts down and say, yeah, I'm not going to work with that one because that makes no sense to me, or to you, or to anyone else. But this is how it works. We have different features and different abilities, which is also a talk I want to weave in here at some point, but which goes a little bit with Greta Thunberg, that are doing the climate activist, and that young girl, and what's been going on there. I just saw a documentary on her and actually discovered that she had been diagnosed with a version of Asperger, which I, of course, I know that is not how. What I want to say is that we should be very careful with diagnosing people that have a different mindset to be some kind of syndrome just because they respond in a different manner, in a different way. But this is the society we live in, where we're trying to deal with all of these new types of humans that have a different energetic composition, a different type of human DNA, which human scientists have not discovered yet, because they can't look into the fourth dimension and see the addings that have been spliced into the human genome, and that then creates different kind of neural networks that works in different manners, and with that creates a different electrochemical composition, which goes in and gives different emotional responses to different things that the other group of humans that were engineered, quote unquote, to be part of the old world order program responded in a different way due to the technologies that were upholding these factory settings for that type of humans. Whereas the new hybrid kids, they have a different programming and they have different neural network and they work in a different way. And this is where I come in as this in between. And if you look into the stellar activation cycle, and if I talk to any clairvoyant at the time, they would say, oh, you got all that blue aura, you're typical indigo, and you're here to build a bridge between the old humans and the new type of humans. And that kind of beautiful ideas that were prominent when I began this work back in 2007 and went to expos and had these discussions. And I thought, well, I actually had something to say until actually that's a story I will tell here, because it also gives indications of some of the things that I have encountered, which many have not encountered. Some have encountered, others have not. And that is not to fit in anywhere. But let me put that in. I went to an expo where I had my little stand and I was doing this planetary academy, which was the first idea, because I actually got a vision. I got, when I was doing my healer education with a group of people, becoming a professional healer, I had this experience of one night I was sitting in the healer room that had a very high level of energy, and I wanted to be that. I always liked being at that very high level of energy. The others were out drinking, and I didn't want to drink, so I was sitting there, and I just enjoyed the silence. And then I got this huge vision of an 2-meter tall male, actually in a robe with similar symbols as the one I talked about in the Enki videos, with the star and the moon and the sun in different, more abstract versions, telling me he was from the brotherhoods of the star, the sun, and the moon. and he had two dogs with him to tell me that was from, actually it was minor canis system, or what do you call it? The canine, is it, they call it, you have got the Sirius system, and you got the smaller dogs that are kind of the two hunting dogs that are close to Orion. And you see, this is where I thought it was because he was from the Sirian system, but you can interpret that one as that figure as the Orion, the hunter, followed by his two dogs, right? So this is again the manipulation, the trickery. Anyways, he came forth and he asked of me to do the planetary hierarchy, the academy, not hierarchy, the planetary academy, where I should work as bridge maker to teach people about the different races that were present on our planet. And that's a story I haven't told out here publicly, but I'm giving that one here and now. And of course, I completely freaked out. That's the first time I've had such a strong holographic imprint. And that was in 2004. And I ran down the stairs out to my friends and the other students that had become my friends. And I was just going, blah, 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 all of this. And I got the other very highly clairvoyant and sensitive female to come with me. And we were up the stairs up to the attic where I'd been sitting. And she felt the presence of what was left of his energy, and she ran down the stairs with me, was screaming, running down the stairs. That was happened. That was hilarious. So again, I won't say that was my proudest moment, but we laughed. That was so funny because we got so freaked out feeling that presence of that male, whatever that was. So that was a time where there was these experiences, including going to a lecture where the guy was talking about time, and he actually had this little, not too tall type of gray figure at his side that were actually giving him the information. He didn't know that, but I could see the gray that was present beside him. Also, a little bit like what's his name? You know, the one from Star Wars and Kenobi, the old one. I can't remember the name of it because that's not where I wanted to go. My brain has a tendency to forget things when I'm going in a different direction. But just to put that one here, so it's not that I haven't that was the earliest versions of this, and it has escalated, of course, but the things have changed, and who is visiting me now are just mostly grays or scavengers or things that are not really worth mentioning, and not the very kind of, yeah, that's interesting, they're actually here to try and teach us something, because things have changed since 2016, and then we had the 2017 galactic core, dark galactic core link up, and that has completely changed our planet and everything that's going on here. So it went from, there actually were some that we could say were interested in upgrading and activating humanity to become part of the galactic communities, into being just the ones that wants us to be suppressed and drained and emptied and harvested and what have you, the scavengers that are left. Anyways, that's not where I wanted to go. I wanted to go with, and I put these two things in because that's kind of what you call happy memories, right? Where things were funny, they were interesting, they kind of open up doors to perceive reality in a different way, which were interesting, and that kind of sparked to life and interest. Aside from, I always had it as a kid, I looked at the sky and stars, always knowing there were things up there that were more than what was shown. And I read the Charles Berlitz's book of the Bermuda Triangle. I read von Daniken's ideas. So you see, I already got imbued with a lot of good ideas, aside from the visions I already had as a kid, the night crawlers that were out at nighttime, they used to scare the crap out of me, the figure beside my bed. I've had a lot, the weird dreams of Men in Black, and you know where I'm going with that one. So just put that in context. So it's not something that I've been unfamiliar with, but where things shifted for me as the further I got into this. In the beginning, it was just all the good stuff, all the interesting stuff, all the interesting visions, the holographic overlay that were fun, right? that kind of got you intrigued and got you kind of hooked and say, oh yeah, I want to go that path. I want to know what that is. And they're here to help humanity. And I can see that they are feeding us with good information, right? And I had my own little Andromedan helper that were giving me visions and talking to me and teaching me stuff. And the further I got into this, the more difficult it became to navigate. And I think the shifting point where things changed for me were where I went to this expo and I had this whole academy thing going. I was healing people. I was brilliant at it. I was really good at doing what I was doing. And people were responding in very powerful ways, having very powerful reactions to the work that I was actually doing in assisting them. But I was beginning to get these dark forces coming in from humans, as well as from the clients I had. They had this dark Orion energy with them. So things were shifting throughout the time of 2008 and 2009. And then I had that expo where I was talking to a very tall female, and I always said I got the vibe that she was Venusian. And today I know the Venusians are also part of that group of Baals under the Nana. So I now know that she was a soldier and she was something else. But the point is, she was working as a healer, and we fell into a conversation. I had my good friend with me. And my good friend was standing to my left, and I was talking to that tall, beautiful, gorgeously Nordic looking Venusian female, full of power, full of all sorts of where you just kind of think, yeah, good for you. And they were standing there, my little skinny glass bearing avian features, right? So anyway, so she was there. And we were having a conversation, and because I felt that she was capable of lifting or dealing with energies on a higher level, I began lifting myself up higher and higher up. And then suddenly, from being that very kind and communicative female that was in front of me, that filled me with awe because she was gorgeous and clever and all the things that you wanted to be within this field, right? And then before something happened, at some point I reached a level in her where she shifted, and instead of having these bright blue eyes, she suddenly got completely black eyes. I'm telling you, she got black eyes. I was just kind of, what? And as I was seeing that, it was just for a moment of time. Then she got a darker type of blue eyes. It was there and it vanished. And then I was attacked energetically from something higher up in her. And that came into her, and that pushed me to such a degree that I became dizzy. I felt nauseous. I was all kind of blah, blah, blah. And I was foggy, and it was very, very unpleasant. And I've had that kind of attack later on where I call it being couched, where all I can do is just lie down or being thrown to the floor or what have you. These kind of enormously strong power plays that are happening when you're talking to people that have entities in them on a higher dimensional level that then decides to come in and push me energetically back, which can be enormously powerful. So, and fortunately for me, I had my friend on my left side, and she dragged me away. She gave an excuse and dragged me away and said, oh, my friend is sick or nauseous or got a low blood sugar or whatever she said. And she drew me away, and I was completely out of it. I don't know what would happen if I hadn't had my friend there, because that attack was very, very strong, and one of the most severe ones I have experienced in a public forum later on in one-on-one sessions. Yes, when I've talked to people over my time, done the template readings, when I did the healings, a lot of attacking were coming in for reasons and purposes. We can always speculate why that is, where others are allowed to do it without being attacked whatsoever, including when I was working with the colontic material, also got a lot of attack coming in from other planes of existence. So with that, she pulled me away, and then I was out in the foyer or in the middle ground where there were no people, and another female actually approached us, and she apparently knew about this energetic attack, because she looked at me and said, "You've been attacked," and she took me over and she healed me and she got my back on my feet, which were quite interesting. And I had a little bit of collaboration with that girl later on, although she again, there at that time we had the interdimensionals present in our reality field. I haven't seen them for a very long time, but she was one of these that were there as an assistant to try and help out in this weird political game that we're actually in the middle of. And I think, due to my experiences, that's one of the things that I see as my force. And you say, well, Rand, you're going to talk about mythology and our interpretation of the mythology and the narratives from where we try to unravel the history of humanity. And I would say you can't trust mythology. There are truths in it, but you can't really trust it. It's written down by people and it's written down for a purpose. And this is where the Copenhagen interpretation I think is a good tool and a good approach, because that states that whatever's been written down was written down because of political interest. There is, when you create a society and you want to have that your city god is the one that's prominent, the one that's in power, you will create a narrative, a story around that god to give that god the power of the right to have the power of that city. So you create the narrative to support the king that is claiming to have that god as his specific protector. You saw that in Egypt as well. We see that already now with politicians that are still very religious. They always claim that God is on his side or her side, because there are females doing the same thing today. So they always claim, well, I am a spokesperson for God. And this is again where you kind of say, well, that's interesting, because you have the other group over there. They're saying that they are also the spokesperson for the same God. So who is it? And we have had several wars where people have claimed that they were fighting, that God were on their side in the war, and they were fighting each other, or both sides claiming that God was on their side. And that's a problem when you only have one God. It was easier in the old Sumerian times, where you had many gods. So you could say that you had that city god, you had Marduk for Babylon, that's the Baal, so he's technically a different bunch than the Anunnaki, but let's just keep it that way. And then you had other gods that were having their own shrines and temples in the different city-states that were there, with each having their local tribal king that were then operating under that type of god, and typically change his name to be somehow connected to that god and often referred to as the Son of God. So you see, when we begin to talk about the whole Jesus Christ and all this kind of things being the Son of God, that's actually a royal title that were given to the king that were to take control of that city-state, or had a tribal right to be the king of that tribe, or what have you. So this is also when we talk about Jesus, as in kind of there were different understandings of it. Was he actually, well, we could say the future Jewish king, and by that word the Son of God, also alluding to Jacob, that were the forefather of the Israeli tribes. That is where we could say that's kind of the claim that Jesus came from these tribes, the genealogy lists that are in the New Testament, where they're trying to put his lineage back to Noah and David and what have you, and all of these kind of things, which is a little bit, that's a make-up as well. That is to also create a narrative around a character. You want to give power, so you create a specific narrative. So we must understand how they wrote the texts back then, what we call the biographies of their persons that they wanted to give power, but at the same time also attribute their position as part of the divine hierarchy, as being some kind of connected to this or that God, or what have you, being the son of that God, meaning that he had been appointed, he had been anointed, which is what we also see it in the stories about Jesus, that he was anointed, which means he was to be king, and by that become the son of God. So this is, when we talk about this, the difference is when you can say, when we talk about we have different gospels and different narratives, and there are many other versions and stories about Jesus which have not been put into the Testament and the Christian Bible. But we have that idea that he was not only the way he was anointed was actually when he was he was first baptized, of course, but that's a Jewish practice as well. And then he was anointed with the Holy Spirit. So this is where you kind of differ, where you say, well, the king was typically anointed with oil. But when we talk about the ancient kings, they were also anointed by the priesthood. And that was also kind of a ceremony where the God descended upon his temple or his city or the shrine or whatever was created. And here we have the differences that kind of, that Jesus was anointed with his body as the temple. And this is kind of a different approach, but that today we would call a walk-in, right? So anyway, I'm just saying here, let's not get too hung up on mythology, because there are levels of truth in it. And I think von Däniken is probably the one that made the best work of that one, trying to interpret some of the stories that we had just taken for granted. The one I remember the most is where you have this, when Moses go up the mountain to get the Ten Commandments, and we have this cloud and thunder and all these kind of things. But if we go in, and that has been worked with in what you call the Contact or Third Degree of Spielberg, with the clouds of thunder. But if we look into the crafts we're seeing on the sky today, and the one I have seen were completely soundless. Yes, it could emanate from the sky, but completely soundless, no thunder, no nothing of that kind. So what is alluded to with the thunder clouds and on the top of the mountain, again, we have to understand the mythology that we both saw with the Greek gods of Olympia on top of the mountain with the thunder god. We have the thunder god here in Denmark with the Nordic gods as well. We have Adad, which is a thunder god, a part of the Anunnaki bunch. We have Yahweh, the original nomadic or Canaan god, and his consort Asherah, the female, and he was a thunder god as well. So what is being told in that story? Is it a craft that is descending? We are having we could think that it is a primitive kind of craft. We could think about that one. Or we could actually think that perhaps he's just telling us with that, first and foremost, it's the mountain, it's a sacred mountain. He walks up the mountain. We have the idea in the Tower of Babel. We have the idea of, when we talk about temples, both in the Mayan culture, the Sumerian culture, the Babylonian culture, most cultures, in Egyptian culture, high buildings that gets humans close to the heaven. So you have to have a mountain. You climb up the mountain to get in contact with the gods, which is a typical way of interpreting things at the time. That's how people saw it. When you go to the sacred mountain, you have this, when I was in Australia as well, when I was walking in Blue Mountain, interestingly enough, there was this high level of residual energies of aboriginals that have seen that area as sacred, because there was all of these mountains and things were happening there, which I completely understand, because at the bottom of the lake I can't remember what that lake is called, there's an ancient craft there that gives this fourth dimensional feature to the whole area, which means aliens can come and go in the Blue Mountains. Of course, it became sacred. Things happened there. And I remember talking to my friend about this, and I was explaining it to her, and I was sensing all of that energy. And while I was doing that, talking about attacks again, right, I was pushed down the stairs. I fell. Yes, I fell over my feet. Yeah, you could say that was an accident. Well, I haven't fallen over my feet in 40 fucking years. So that was clearly, and when I fell down the stairs, it was slow motion. So, and I got the scare scare and I had that kind of scratch that created blood. And that's a typical attempt from dark entities to enter. So that's scare, push out the control of the emotional field so it gets a little bit outside the body. You have a blood sacrifice, and yam, you can get something that possesses you. And that I struggled with that one after that. So connecting to that area also connected to some of the holographic, fifth dimensional, run amok entities of the darker lineages that are roaming around on the astral plane as well. Anyways, so just putting that in context. But when we talk about this whole interpretation of Moses going up the mountain, it could just as well be him going up the mountain, because that's the only way when you have an ancient civilization or a people that are saying this. He went up the sacred mountain to talk to the god in a thundercloud, which means the god was a thunder god, and by that had his right as a warrior god. And that's why we also see in the Exodus that Yahweh is striking people, killing people with lightning, and all of these power surges. That proves that he is a thunder god, a god of the weather, of electricity, of power, which is what the thunder gods are, typically war gods. So Yahweh is a warrior god. You get that in the interpretation of the other material with Jericho, where they take down the walls of Jericho by sound and instruments, by the power of God, making him a warrior god. And you have the staff of Aaron, you have the staff with the staff of Aaron is where he actually do a contest with the Egyptian priesthood, where he shows that he has greater power than they have, because his God is Yahweh, the only one, the Lord over all gods. So that's the superior war god. And you have Moses' staff as well, dividing the oceans. And then when the Pharaoh, the Egypts try to cross the Red Sea, is it actually the red as in color red, or just the Red Sea as in the reed seed, right? The reed sea as of kind of, well, it is talked about as water, but there's an interesting point there. And then the Pharaoh goes out there, and then the waters are no longer divided and they drown, which is also a way to overcome an army. So we're here talking about a war god with enormous power. So that's just as well interpreted in that manner, just to put it in context. So we should not put too much evidence into mythology, because we have to understand the time that they were written and the purpose of why they were written and the function they had to give credibility to the king or to the spokesperson or to their savior or whatever it was. If you want someone to have power, you always say he or she is acting on the behalf of God, or he or she is acting on the behalf of Jesus Christ, or same as St. Paul, just using that one, he had this, he was a zealot, a jealous zealot. He was actually hunting down the Christians, the early Christians that claimed that they were Jews, but they believed that Jesus was the anointed one. They believed he was going to be the new king of Judea. He was of the lineage of David, so he was to be the new king and not the one that they were already in power, which I've forgotten the name of. Herodes, that was his name. He was seen as an illegitimate king. He was not really of the true Jewish lineages, etc. So they saw him as an impostor. He was working with the Romans. So he was not really Jewish in the understanding of that. So you had that group of Jews that saw Jesus as the true teacher, the true rabbi, the true coming king that would save the Jews from this heretic, this wrongful type of king in Herodes that were of the wrong lineage. He had got power the wrong way, and he was working with the Romans. As I said, he was impure. He was not upholding the practices the way he should as a Jewish king, and onward and so forth. And they saw Jesus as being this saving king, the savior that would save them from this false king, and then the rightful king of the rightful lineage would come back in power. And that's how you want to interpret that whole story, with that group of Jews that actually had their headquarters in Jerusalem, and we know that Paul had issues with this group of Jews, including two of the brothers of Jesus, whether or we are talking about actual physical brothers, as in born of the same family, or we're talking about brothers as in kind of brotherhoods. That's still up for debate, but there are ideas where we could kind of say it alludes more to actually be physical brothers of Jesus, but we don't have much evidence of that due to the way that things were written as a kind of a story to create or generate power for someone, right? So how does St. Paul get his position? Well, he claims to have had a vision of Jesus that then changes him and tells him that he is to work with the Greek population, because he came from the Greek sections of he came from Tarsus, I think it's called in English, where you had Jewish people, but they were of the Greek origin. They were schooled Greek. They taught Greek. They were amongst the Greek, even though they were Jewish. We also have the Egyptian diaspora. We have Jews in Egypt as well, in Alexandria. They are the ones that actually recreated the Hebrew Bible. So we have different groups of Jews scattered all over the place, as we have today. So there were different places, and they have different versions of how to interpret Judaism, just to put in that direction. So you had the infight between the factions already back then. So if you are to say, well, for some odd reason, I am not in any way or form saying that St. Paul didn't have his vision. I completely think that that's the case. He was blinded for days. He had all of these weird symptoms of having had some kind of thing that happened, but he was also a mystic. That's actually, I wanted to do my thesis, my bachelor degree thesis on Paul as a mystic, but I couldn't find enough evidence for it. So I ended up doing a thesis of Teresa of Avila, the Christian saint that had a lot of visions, and trying to put psychology and clairvoyance and all of these things together. It didn't go very well because there's not enough scientific research on that topic of people that actually have these enormous amount of visions, as Teresa of Avila had. You have her biography and what she experienced as a nun within the Christian church, having all of these, worship of the devil, worship of Jesus Christ. You have Francis of Assisi, who had the stigmata, the bleeding wounds from his hands, and onward and so forth. And you can say, well, you can kind of psych yourself into have a physical response to something, but that does not account for the experiences I have had and other people have had, and onward and so forth. So it's a complete uncharted territory of these kind of what is it when people have visions? What are the mystics? What are they actually seeing? Because here we again going when we talk spirituality. You have the mystics and you have the ones that are the occult. The occult are typically going more in a scientific reaction, or not reaction, a scientific approach, which more goes with what we call magic. And you have the mystics that are having all these visions and are typically associated with being connected to some sort of deity. And that's not necessarily the case. These are just classifications done later on by scientists that are trying to navigate through all this different type of material we have. So we are having a lot of what we could say written text from different groups of people that have had different types of experiences. And I think we should be very careful with classifying something to be truth or not truth, because we just do a simple example from your own everyday life. Tell me about an experience from your childhood, especially if you have your brother or sister, and where they were present, and then ask them to give an account of that experience, or just go into the city with one of your friends and you will experience something and they give different accounts of the same experience. And you will see that you will not have seen the same thing. You will not have looked at the same people. You would not have experienced it the same way, which is interesting because you kind of think that we interpret things and experience things in the same manner, and we don't. We experience according to our knowledge base of what we are, what we understand, what we are perceiving in the moment. And then we have our own narrative that goes on in the interpretation of it. Remember, I'm a psychotherapist, right? So I've been working with that for over 15 years. So we have our own interpretation of what's going on, colored by our electrochemical reactions to it, colored by the way our brain works, colored by what we perceive and what we're capable of perceiving. So it all comes down to the neural network, right? And the electrochemical reactions to what we're actually seeing, what we're not seeing. Because if you have a little bit of brain anatomy, you know that the hippocampus that stores this kind of memory, that's kind of the memory section in the brain. It's in the middle, in the amygdala. So if you have kind of, which is based upon the idea, the hippocampus and the amygdala and the cerebellum, which is yes, the little brain. I always kind of, it's the cerebrum, that's the big brain, the cerebellum is the little brain. The little brain is what we typically call the instinctual level, but it controls, it actually holds 80% of the active neurons in the brain that's always going on somehow. And it's not completely understood what it is. It might sound that when you read text out there, but actually isn't, because there are things that doesn't add in. We want to put it, it's just the motor system, the whole kind of what we call sympathetic nervous system, all the processes of the body that functions automatically that are controlled by the little brain. But it's not there. It's also connected to memory. It's also connected to what we could call instinctual survival, but that's not the whole case. Is also connected to other processes. But there is a tendency to that if you have a moment of fear, you will recall it. Your hippocampus will be ignited, adrenal glands will be ignited, the little brain will be ignited, and the amygdala will be ignited. And by that, you remember these experiences, but in that heightened adrenal state, which shut off the frontal lobes and long thinking processes and make you respond quickly, as in fight or flight or survival or what have you, or whatever that's going on. It's very basic, it's very instinctual, it's very biological, just to put that one in as well. So I think when we do talk about this whole, when we do the blueprint, the templates and the understandings of what humans are and human aren't, and the vast types of mythology across the world where humans are made to be of service of the gods, somehow, somewhere, that's interesting. And it's not because we can do as they did it 200 years ago. The German scientists and the white man scientists thought that we kind of only had different groups of people on different places on the planet, and they were not in contact with each other. We know that today that's not true. They were traveling across the ocean and what have you. So they were sharing stories, of course. So we could go in one angle and say, well, it's because everybody was kind of reproducing the same version of the gods in their own language, in their own culture, in some way, somehow, to produce that collective consciousness field of ideas, as Carl Gustav Jung calls the subconscious, or the collective subconscious of all humans on the planet. We in a way share the same genes and the same way of interpreting reality, and that is traded or handed over through generations, through our mitochondrial DNA or through our human DNA, biological DNA. And I'm putting in a distinction there, because science will tell you that the mitochondrial DNA is actually an old type of bacteria that were part of the earlier versions of bacteria on our planet when the atmosphere did not have oxygen. They were anaerobic. They didn't need oxygen. So that's the mitochondria. That's why it has its own DNA. And then we had the whole cell structure that came later on, the eukaryotic cells that came later on, that were oxygen based, that encapsulated it, and it became part of our cell as an individual power system. But actually fuels a part of the fueling of power of our body, which is interesting. So that's also to be taken into consideration. So if we go back with this whole Van Daniken idea that the gods engineered us, there's a lot of when we talk in terms of sciences, we can't say science are wrong. We can't do that. There are specific types of evidence. We can always say interpretation of it might be in the manner that we would like it to be. But this is, again, butting heads on interpretation of things we don't really know, so we can only interpret from what we think and what we believe and what our belief systems are and the way our brain works and the way we perceive reality and our cognitive schemata, how our structural layers of our brain are built up. So you have people that have a different type of genetic composition. They will interpret information in a specific way because their neural network kicks off in a specific manner using specific receptors that unravels specific levels of the neurons, where others will have a different electrochemical composition, and the same spark, the same ignition, the same synaptic ignition will interpret information in a different manner. So we are a little bit out on, as we say it in Danish, directly translated, the field of the Lord. We are out where the crows will not even turn back. Again, translation of Danish items. But the understanding is here that when we are trying to navigate in this environment of mythology, internet information, sciences, memories, visions, religion, spirituality, what have you, those of us who are doing this, we need to take it to the next level. We need to really understand scientific method. We need to understand psychology. We need to understand biology. We need to understand evolutionary theory. We need to understand astronomy. We need to understand a lot of things, including chemical sciences, to really get a handle on what are we actually dealing with. Is it even possible to follow up with the ideas of von Däniken or Sitkin and his ideas of engineering a human? Yes, you could say you have the original trinity of gods of Enlil and Enki, and actually the womb goddess, I forgot what her name is, and they decided, because you have the whole creational story there where you had the gods, the Anunnaki, they had the minor gods serving for them, harvesting, mining the earth, and they got tired and they rioted, and from that because you couldn't have that rioting of the minor gods. You have the same ideas with the angels that rose up and wanted to become similar like God in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And again, the Old Testament is because when we do the Christianity, we have the New Testament, the Old Testament. That's the Christian interpretation of it, whereas the Hebrew Bible is the original Torah, right? So anyways, just to make a distinction there. But when we talk about these gods, the minor gods that rioted, and we have this hierarchy of gods, which we see in Hindu mythology as well, and the Olympic gods and the Greek gods and what have you, they rioted, and by that, then this little trinity of Enlil and Enki and Ninursak, I think or there are different names. They had different names, all depending on which version we're talking about. They went together and they had all of these disputes and trickery and what have you, and they made it as a collaboration. So if we go in and say that Enki comes and say, I have the blueprint, well, if you read the mythology behind it and study it a little bit in different variations, different translations, you will see, well, he didn't have the full picture, did he? He didn't have it on his own. There were Enlil that added in something, and Ninursak, she was the one that put in the womb the creation of life to it. And they also sacrificed one of the other gods that were clever so that there was something to be built off. Seriously, they sacrificed one of their own. So this is again where you go in and say, okay, that's a different story, isn't it? But one of the things I think we should put in here, especially when we talk about the Sumerian gods, they are full of infight. They are tricking each other, getting each other drunk, getting each other into the netherworlds. They're doing all sorts of horrible things to each other. They were really a bunch of rogue, non-pleasant type of gods, to be honest, similarly as we see it with the Greek gods. So to round this up a little bit, I'm not giving you a lot of answers, because when we talk about these processes of information, we are creating a pattern of understanding. It's not a simple answer. It's not a linear process as I talk about in transition science classes. It's not as in kind of A, B, C, and then you get D or something where 2 plus 2 gives 4. No, we are creating a pattern of synergy. We're actually initiating a process of understanding, where one question leads to an answer, and that answer leads to more questions. And these questions must be investigated. That's the scientific method. You don't find the answers. You have a process of investigating, of understanding, and you create theories while you're investigating these things of what it could be. But they are just theories because we don't have the truth globe of information. We haven't got any kind of what you call a list of these are the answers, because this is a planet, this is a humanity, this is a system, the aliens out there, or whatever's going on. We are all living under developmental processes. We are all living through different transitional processes of different forms of energy, and that energy feedbacks in and amplifies our either DNA or our consciousness potentials or neural network or electrochemical processes of our body, which we call epigenetics. We have this whole changing scenario all the time. So coming in and claiming, I know the answer to that one is not from where I'm sitting, is not the right approach to do this, including when we talk about what is right and what is wrong. We can only talk about our gut feeling, and then we can come up with a lot of fancy explanations why we think that our gut feeling is right. Because that's how humans do it. We want to be right. We want to show that we know what we're dealing with here. So we come up with all sorts of fancy explanations, as I have here. But the point is that when you work scientifically, and that's where kind of when we have the scientific method, where you have these books, as I read when I was trying to find evidence of Paul being a mystic and working, because he talks about the 7 heavens and all these kind of things. And there are scholars that have approached that, but they put in so much information, but so many other scholars to underline and underscore their idea, that whatever idea they have, it just drowns in all of the others that they are putting in, the peer-reviewed, the consensus-based, that others think this, and use that to prove their point, as in kind of, it's in a way, perhaps not so much anymore, but the older groups of scientists, it was as if you said, I think this, then you would be kind of shut down and say, you're not allowed to think anything on your own. You have to underscore, underbase it, or underline it and support it with what everybody else has been thinking, because this is where we work on the shoulders of the ones that have gone before us. And we are all agreeing that that's the paradigm within we work. If you want to get finances to do your work, you work within the paradigm. You're not allowed to think on your own. You have to build up your case using the information of others. And that's one of the things where I kind of step down of the scientific method, because that's where I'm kind of saying, well, then science is not going anywhere, is it? If we're all building on what everybody else is saying, where's the pioneers? Because the pioneer is clearly not getting the funds, is clearly not getting supported in his or her work. So the pioneer is not really getting the ideas out there, or is she? Let's just do the she here, because she will not get the funds, and by that will not create the new paradigm. So this is where those of us who are doing this is where we need to, when we are doing this, not just to drive it on half sayings and books of people that claim to be researchers that have looked into the stories and are interpreting in a specific way. We can, of course, say that's a new paradigm, and that is what I'm working with the higher order psychic energetic method. Because of these experiences here, trying to find some kind of method where we can actually begin to use that clairvoyant method. And I want to talk a little bit about that in the next podcast. Thank you.